America's involvement in Ukraine and its relations with Russia's President Vladimir Putin will be a key issue in the campaign. Now, a shocking report out of Moscow, where mercenary chief Yezgeny Prigozhin and top officers of his private Wagner military group have been confirmed dead in a plane crash that was widely seen as an assassination. Prigozhin attempted a once unthinkable military mutiny against Putin in late June. He was among the 10 people killed in the business jet crash Wednesday. U.S. and other Western officials long expected Putin to go after Prigozhin, despite promising to drop charges in a deal that ended the mutiny. Turning to the Middle East, where the chairman of the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff is visiting Israel. The head of Israel's defense forces hosted General Mark Milley in Tel Aviv. The trip billed as a farewell visit to General Milley's 4-year term, which ends very soon. Lieutenant General Herzi Halevi noted that Milley's time was marked by unprecedented joint operations between our two nations. Also in the Middle East, in Syria, evangelical Christians are calling for urgent prayer on behalf of a kidnapped pastor. They're calling him Pastor Jacob for security reasons. Jacob was kidnapped last weekend by members of the Druze community. The elders in the community have threatened to execute Jacob unless they get 4 billion in Syrian pounds for his safe return. That's roughly about $305,000 US. Jacob has a wife and 1-year daughter. Syrian Christians have appealed to the Druze leadership to spare his life. Coming up, China gradually building up its control of one of the most important resources in the world, food. And we'll hear how their potential dominance could eventually even be a threat to the United States. That story when we come back. Welcome back to CBN NewsWatch. Here's a question. What would happen if a hostile government seized control of our nation's food supply? Would Americans relent and submit to avoid starvation? Communist China is gradually moving in to control the agricultural industry in Africa. Appearing on this week's episode of The Global Lane, Kip Tom, a former U.S. ambassador to the UN, explains why Chinese dominance of the global food supply would pose a danger to Africa and the world, including the United States.
The reality is we tend to go in, the United States goes in with capacity and compassion and gives the humanitarian aid through the World Food Program and a lot of other organizations. But the reality is the Chinese Communist Party goes in through every country in Africa, investing in infrastructure and other projects, and actually capturing the country's abilities natural resources. But their ultimate goal is to have Africa be the breadbasket for the country of China to feed their 1.4 billion people.
Well, what specifically then is China doing to make Africa its food basket? What specifically are they doing?
Well, I think there's a number of elements that China's exercising. One is they go in, as I said, they build these death spirals. You may have one country or many of the countries across Africa take a World Bank loan out for building bridges, roads, dams, any kind of infrastructure you can imagine, and then they default or can't make the payment. China comes in and buys that debt out for a minimal amount, and then the country is beholden to them. And they usually get natural resources and other elements of what the country can offer to them to support the Chinese Communist Party and the needs of the people of China. So you go into Africa and you see it firsthand what's going on. I mean, you go into the capital of Zimbabwe, Harare, you go there. The Chinese, you'll see a sign on every street corner, every street vendor is Chinese. They've displaced the African workforce. They got cameras on every street corner. We've seen that everywhere. We also see China coming in and building military installations in Djibouti, South Africa as well. So China wants to seize control of the continent of Africa. And it's not about the mining and the critical minerals. It's about agricultural productivity.
Well, you mentioned that South Africa, China President Xi Jinping was in South Africa this week, strengthening his ties with that country at the BRICS conference. Also, Chinese officials this week visited Nigeria to meet with that country's leadership. And, of course, in recent years, you mentioned this, China has aggressively courted and influenced numerous African countries to work food, trade, and investment deals. So what does that mean for the United States and the world?
Well, I think, one thing that COVID exposed to us, as well as the Ukrainian war, was the supply chains that were critical to the United States in producing food, fiber, and energy. When you look at a nation's power, it's based upon four critical elements: economic, military, diplomatic, and informational. I will add two other elements to that, and that is food and energy. And when you look at Africa, China is looking at that, and they want to capture the ability to produce food, get the energy production that they need for their own nation, and that's why they're so focused. They want to get away from dealing with the United States, period.
Well, I know they're even moving into the U.S. here. I mean, we've seen them buy up some farmland. What is that risk?
That's a significant risk. I think we're going to be dealing with in a very short order, whether it's on the federal level and state level is already working on it. The reality is I'm more concerned about the Chinese Communist Party and different elements of the country coming in and buying companies that hold intellectual property that's been developed here in the United States, that once they buy that company, they can then convert that intellectual property that we've worked on here in the United States, done the research and development, and move that over into China and benefit themselves at a very low cost. So I'm more concerned about their investments in our country, taking companies to get the intellectual property.
And back to the food, though, if they control food, the food supply and food markets around the world, how dangerous is that for the American people?
Food is power. We need to remember that, and this is very dangerous for the United States. So one of the warnings I would offer to the United States is let's make sure that we have a regulatory environment that lets us onshore more of our critical building blocks to produce food, fiber, and energy. That would be replacing, for instance, fertilizer that comes from Russia or Belarus or China, or critical components to build the crop care products that we protect our crops with from insects and weeds and other diseases that come out of China. So the United States, this is a wake-up call. And we could be a food power, and we could use it in a manner that benefits the United States, but our friends and allies around the world.
Well, there's a lot Congress could do about it, right?
Absolutely.
Okay. Former U.S. Ambassador to the UN Agencies for Food and Agriculture, Kip Tom, thank you for sharing your time and insights. We appreciate it.
I appreciate your time today and your audiences. Thank you.
Excellent interview there, Gary. Thank you. Also this week on The Global Lane, we'll have more on that urgent prayer request for a kidnapped Syrian pastor threatened with execution. And the premiere this week of the great American family film, Strong Fathers, Strong Daughters. You can catch The Global Lane tonight on the CBN News channel at 8:30 Eastern. You can also see it on the CBN News app or on YouTube. Still ahead, the revival in Hollywood. Hits like Jesus Revolution and Sound of Freedom are taking center stage at the box office. Now the booming market of faith-based films is capturing the industry's attention. We'll look at the future of Christian cinema and get a sneak peek at the upcoming movies right after this. Welcome back. As movies like Jesus Revolution and Sound of Freedom continue to surprise at the box office, the future for faith and family-friendly entertainment is definitely looking up. CBN's Billy Hollowell talks with industry leaders to find out how we got to this point and what's next.
While Hollywood seems to focus on franchises, reboots, and R-rated content to resurrect audience numbers, faith and family-friendly entertainment is reaching new heights. Movie Guide founder Dr. Ted Baer says this hasn't always been the case because Tinseltown has a checkered history presenting biblical content.
It's coming back in a big way. So we're actually, the first Christian movies, the first Passion Play was 1897. So then there were 3 in 1898. So they go in waves.
Rich Peluso, head of Sony's Christian arm of Affirm Films, agrees, saying those waves often led to washouts.
when motion pictures first started, most of the content being created was biblical in nature because it was a commonly understood IP, right? Intellectual property. People knew the story in the book. And then it kind of fell out of fashion. And then we saw the second wave kind of in the 50s and 60s with kind of robe and sandal movies.
Despite the popularity of films like The Greatest Story Ever Told and Cecil B. DeMille's 10 Commandments, Peluso says it took a 2004 blockbuster to wake up Hollywood to the idea of bringing faith into the contemporary drama space.
It took some creative people that started to be able to tell dramatic contemporary stories in a way that had themes that were accessible to kind of the unchurched. And while those things were kind of bubbling up, Mel Gibson released The Passion of the Christ. And what happened was it was such a massive success that all the Hollywood studios realized that there was this massive underserved audience.
They had to pay attention.
They had to pay attention.
A decade later, other independent projects further exposed the power of the faith audience. The success of God's Not Dead and other projects led critics to dub 2014 the Year of the Bible. Pureflix co-founder Michael Scott remembers the risk of taking God's Not Dead to theaters.
That was the first film we had to raise a significant amount of P&A. P&A means the marketing dollars to advertise a film. They call it P&A in the industry. And we basically had to raise $5 million to take out God's Not Dead. We spent a little over $1 million on the film. We're in $6 million. That's a lot of money still, you know? And I'm thinking down on my hands and knees, just praying to God, saying, I hope the film makes in total $6 million.
And as history shows, the Lord answered that prayer tenfold.
Opening weekend, God had a different thing. It did almost $10 million and went on to do $60 million. And I think that was a catalyst that allowed us to take that, launch the streaming company, do more theatrical films, put more product into the marketplace, and it was just a wonderful thing that took place.
Even more wonder what happened after Sony purchased Pureflix, followed by a merger with the TV network Great American Family. Given the overall growth in major studio appeal and faith content, a key question persists. What happens next?
One thing that can happen, and I think it will happen, is the studios can put more money into these Christian films. The average budget for a studio film is advertising is $50 million, and the average budget for a studio release of a Christian film like Jesus Revolution is only $10 million.
Dr. Baer says bigger budgets can lead to increased awareness and larger audiences, but only if studio executives envision a pattern of success with Christian movies.
Hollywood follows these trends. I do believe that you can follow the trends and see what happens.
Some companies are taking bold chances with new Christian subgenres. For instance, Peluso is preparing for the fall release of Journey to Bethlehem, a musical about the Nativity story.
It is a full-on narrative live-action musical with choreography and dance and joy and fun, and a villain in King Herod, played by Antonio Banderas. So they can expect an incredible journey that is harmonious with Scripture, but really relatable to people that don't even know the story.
While box office success is usually the gold at the end of the rainbow for Hollywood studios, Scott believes there's a more profound and eternal purpose for faith films.
I think our soul and our spirit craves something to be inspired, hope, redemption. And I say that our content, we can be the light in the darkness. You're in a totally dark room, you light one single match and it chases away the darkness. We can be that single match with a piece of content that will light up your heart, your soul. And I think it'll be, is what people crave ultimately.
And actress and director Sherry Rigby echoes these sentiments.
I think people really they're hungry for family values again. They're hungry for substance, redemption, valued stories about men and women. And so I think we have an actual culture that's looking for that. And the beautiful thing is I believe that the Lord has positioned believers in a position so that over these last several years that we've seen this industry come up, we're sharpening our skills.
The recent box office successes, combined with projects like Journey to Bethlehem and Unsung Hero on the way, we're likely to see a further expansion into new types of faith content. While we wait for that dynamic to unfold, one reality remains clear. The audience showing up is the main ingredient for future success. Billy Hollowell, CBN News.
Thank you, Billy. Coming up, a teenager in Minnesota goes fishing and reels in a much bigger catch than he planned. We'll tell you what he caught and how he did a good deed with it when we come back. That story in a moment. Finally today, a Minnesota teenager made a big catch on a fishing expedition recently. And like many fishing stories, it's a surprising tale. 14-year-old Connor Halso was fishing with his family on the Lake of the Woods in Minnesota, a body of water that's about 70 miles long and 20 feet deep. When he felt his line pull, the teen reeled in his line to find a wallet on the other end, filled with $2,000 in cash. He also found a business card inside and tracked down the owner, get this, a farmer from Iowa who lost the money in rough waters last year. The farmer drove to Minnesota to retrieve his wallet and offer the teen a reward. Connor, he turned down the cash reward, but said yes to a custom-made cooler and dinner with his family and the farmer. That's so cool. Wow. A year later. That's it for this edition of CBN NewsWatch. Remember, you can find more of our awesome news programs on the CBN News channel anytime or online with cbnnews.com. Also, tell us what you think about the stories you've seen by emailing newswatch@cbn.com. Or you can reach out to us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Folks, from all of us here on the headquarters of the Christian Broadcasting Network, we hope you'll join us next time. Until then, goodbye and God bless.